In her book, Virtue Hoarders, The Case Against the Professional Managerial Class, author Catherine Liu makes the case that the professional managerial class stands in the way of social justice and economic redistribution by promoting meritocracy, philanthropy, and other self-serving operations. Catherine Liu is a professor of film and media studies at the University of California, Irvine. She joins us now to expand on this. Welcome, Professor.
Hi, good morning.
Well, we spoke recently about some of these issues, but for people who aren't in the know, can you explain what the professional managerial class really is and why it's a problem?
So this is a class that has college credentials and usually is tied to a professional organization. So we're all members of this class. We graduated, we probably have post-secondary degrees, and we believe in information, in learning. And we also don't really think of ourselves as workers. Our interests are aligned with the interests of professional managers and technocrats and engineers who are also members of our class. Now, since I'd say, 2008, this class has also been in trouble. But the top members of this class, the elites of the PMC, are copiously rewarded by capitalists. We're not small business owners. We usually work in large organizations. More and more of us as young people like yourselves are freelancers, but we really believe in the power of the degree and of the professions. If you think about the U.S. in the early 20th century, this class was not very powerful. The AMA, the American Medical Association, was just forming. The Modern Languages Association, which is the professional organization that governs tenure, was just forming. And we were much less organized as a class. Today, we're much more powerful. We make up about 25% of the workforce. And I would say that our interests are not aligned with the interests of blue-collar workers, who are still the majority of Americans.
So the fact of there being multiple classes isn't necessarily a problem in and of itself. What makes the PMC pernicious, if you will, is the idea that they are performing a role that is against the class interest of working class voters?
Well, part of the class problem and contradiction is that there is a struggle for power and legitimacy. And the working classes did have more power. Let's say right after World War II, and 5 million people were on strike at any given time in the United States. It's a problem when you have a class that hoards all of capital and legitimacy and cultural content to itself. Obviously, Brianna, classes are a problem. The aristocracy and the monarchy in 18th century France was a serious problem. They were sucking France dry. So just as the industrialists of the 19th century in England were sucking the life force out of people and profiting from colonies and the industrial revolution in the northern parts of England, where factories were growing and people's lives were actually getting worse, but capitalists were getting richer. So I would say class is a problem, but class struggle and class contradiction is something that we should be aware of. In America, we don't talk about it. There's Catherine, a real taboo, an ideological taboo.
So, Catherine, what's interesting about this is you just mentioned that the professional managerial class has grown, right? So you mentioned that this has grown because it wasn't very large after World War II, so not as many people went off to college. I know, in my family, for example, my dad is one of 8 kids. He was the only one in that group that went to college, whereas in my generation, more of us went to college, right, in each subsequent generation. So this class is growing. So what's interesting about this is anyone can join this class, it sounds like. It's not one that you're necessarily born into.
No. That's right. Well, that's a good point, because it's supposed to be against inherited privilege. And we have this idea of social mobility that anyone can ascend to this class. But if your parents are working $12 an hour jobs and they're agricultural workers or they're low-paid service workers, your chances, no matter how brilliant you are, of getting into an elite school, of being able to handle the competition, and then despite all of our programs that are supposed to be promoting first-gen students, and then graduate from that school and go on to graduate school to get a professional degree that will allow you to, acculturate and perform for this class, your chances are very, very slim. America, was built on the ideal of social mobility. And as you say, your family experienced that after World War II. World War II was a great after World War II, universities expanded. There was real redistribution of wealth from the top down, and it happened through education. Education was a gateway for working class people to enter the professional managerial class. Today, now, the PMC gatekeeps. Education is now a gatekeeper that tries to keep people out and tries to bring in only the initiates. But we see how corrupt higher ed is with Operation Varsity Blues that brought down Rick Singer and his pay-to-play, his racketeering of higher education entry for very, very rich people. That is actually just the tip of the iceberg in terms of how corrupt our elites are.
Well, I agree with that. I was not agreeing with you earlier, but I agree with and I have expressed concern about the extent of the influence of highly educated liberal arts grads and their cultural influence, and then their influence on law and policy and finance and other things has seemed to me to become more pernicious over time. I'm not sure I agree that were you saying that the industrial class, the Industrial Revolution, I think there was an improvement, right, over factory labor, over backbreaking farming and poverty was an improvement for many people, which is why they left the country to go to the city.
I agree with that. And I also think that a neglected aspect of factory work is that women could perform wage work. Whereas when you lived on the farm and you worked for the farm, you were working in a patriarchal society. It was enriching your family. And so the independence of young women who became wage workers and in factories from Liverpool to Shenzhen now is a really, really important step in the advance of women's rights, let's say. So it was an improvement, but the back-breaking nature of the labor extraction in factories in England and in southeastern China was like, people were like 16-hour days is our standard. The employer did not say, your boss did not say, oh, I think you're too tired. Maybe we should have you only work 8-hour days. It was worker unrest that produced those better conditions for manufacturing and blue-collar workers. China now is experiencing a great deal of worker unrest because the levels of prosperity and expectation of work has really changed. But between 2000, 2010, 2012, people were living in rooms, 10 to 12 a person in dormitories. They were rotating, sleeping in beds. Young women arrived from the countryside at the age of 16, were burnt out at 21. They made our iPhones, and they worked 16-hour days. Conditions have improved somewhat since then. So I agree with you that conditions improve for them from the countryside, but the extraction of labor in the factories in the city would go untrammeled if it weren't for worker demand.
Catherine, I just have one question for you. As a professor at University of California, Irvine, the student demographic, I'm here in California as well. I'm in Los Angeles. I graduated from University of California, Davis. The demographic is 15% white, right? Everybody else at the University of California, the undergrad class is majority Asian. Then you've got a lot of Hispanics, multi-ethnic. White is the minority. So I'm curious, how do you reconcile this notion that it's only the privileged that are able to enter this class, when I would argue that a lot of the kids that are getting into the University of California system in particular are, like myself, on one side, I mentioned my World War II kind of, after World War II, how my family was. But my other side, I'm a daughter of a Vietnamese immigrant. And they worked their rear ends off in nail salons, scrubbing feet in order to make sure that my generation could go to college. And we did. And so how are you seeing a shift? Are the students coming in now coming from, their parents are also college grads, and there's more of this kind of keeping with the class?
The UC serves first-generation students and immigrant students and minority students in an incredible way. I think we are educating, though, the best of the best in California. They are not part of the cultural elites that will enter the professional managerial class on the East Coast. If you go to Sarah Lawrence, Wellesley, Yale, Harvard, Princeton, you're at a different level. Now, at the UC, we say we're going to produce mass education for the mass of Californians. It's going to have that quality. But my students are often coming from, as you say, working class families or first generation families whose parents have made it through small business. And they are not involved in the culture wars of the PMC that take place on the East Coast. They're incredibly open-minded. They're incredibly hardworking. And they don't care about the identity politics stuff that is happening on Twitter in such an intense way. They're not the undergraduates at Williams or at Wellesley or at whatever a small liberal arts college is deciding to innovate on policing the way people talk to each other. So I really celebrate the UC. Of course, we've been undermined by generations of budget cutting and things like that, but we are one of the reasons why I feel like I'm really dedicated to my job, despite the BS that's coming from the administration and the managerial class in the university, is that I feel like I serve the mass of Californians. And I feel like I serve working class and middle class people.
Virtue Hoarders, the case against the professional managerial class. Catherine Liu, we really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
We'll be back with more Rising right after this.